I'm Joey D'Antoni. I'm principal consultant at Denny Cherry and Associates Consulting. I have a bunch of things with M behind my name, so I just abbreviated with M star, because that's what developers do, right? So who's this guy? Does anybody know who this guy is? This is Maxim Yusubets. He wants to steal your data and sell it to the Russian mafia. Actually, he wants to sell it to anybody else who'll buy it. That's his custom Lamborghini that cost 400,000 pounds and who knows how many rubles. And his license plate is Russian for thief. He runs a business called Evil Core. Yes, there's a real company called Evil Core. I'll give you one guess as to what country it's in. Yeah, it's Russia. And yeah, you can guess who he works with in Russia, because he makes a lot of money there. These people are evil. They're trying to steal your data. They're trying to hack your systems. They want to ransomware you, because guess what? Ransomware is a very effective business. You know why ransomware attacks are so popular? Anybody? They work. Lots of people pay ransoms, or else they get their money, their data stolen. These attacks happen all the time. We're going to talk about kind of 9 or so different ways that these attacks not only can happen, but are more successful. Everybody's going to get attacked, and it's fine if some user's laptop gets ransomwared. What you don't want is some user's laptop getting ransomwared, and then 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months later, your entire server farm getting pwned. Unfortunately, we still see attacks. So this is a search of just the term ransomware, and you can see all of the recent attacks. Just last week, I saw the Minnesota public school district in the U.S. In Minneapolis, one of the top 20 cities in the U.S. by population. Their school district was unavailable for 3 or 4 days. It's a constant flow of these attacks, and they all kind of work in similar ways, but slightly differently depending on the nature of the attack. And we're going to talk through some of the ways that happen, because there's a lot of things that are common. There are a lot of things, the way we've been doing things in technology the last 50 years, where security was an afterthought, and we kind of tried to implement it after the fact. So we're going to talk about some things you can do to make things better. And this is our kind of topic of our table of contents for this session. And this is from an article I wrote for Redmond magazine a few years ago. They put together this really nice graphic for me called the Data Breach Game. And it's really cool because the prize is a GDPR fine. So there are lots of things that I see as problems across organizations. We're going to talk through each of these in detail. Credential use. When I worked at Comcast Cable, we had 3,000 SQL servers, and they all had the same SA password. And it probably hasn't changed since then. Service accounts being domain admin. If you do that, I'll talk to you in a few slides. Port 1433 being open to the internet. Azure used to encourage you to do this, and it was awesome. Spear phishing attacks. Don't click on anything. Just don't use email. Just give up on email. Public S3 buckets. We also have public Azure Blob storage containers. Both of these are viable. It's just harder to make your Azure container public. Public MongoDB with no password. I thought we figured this out in 2000 when SQL Slammer happened and everybody had SQL Server 7 running with no SA password. But no, people still let admin users to databases created with no password. Elasticsearch does it too. All bad things. SMB 1.0. I saw on Reddit sysadmin the other day, we have this system that needs to run SMB 1.0. Sorry, your shit should get hacked again. Private keys in your GitHub repo. I actually did this yesterday, and I will say, I will give GitHub credit. I accidentally put a connection string with a password in it, and GitHub sent me 10 emails yelling at me instantly, and I don't have any of the fancy stuff turned on in my GitHub sub. And then finally, but last but not least, an old favorite, SQL injection attacks. Those are still good for a few data breaches every year. Credential reuse. Is this the password you use at every site? $ my pet's name, plus $ my birth year, plus a random integer. If that's the case, stop. Get a password manager, except not LastPass, because they suck. I like to recommend 1Password. I think there's some open source stuff you can compile, but I don't have that time. 1Password just works. But reusing credentials isn't secure. Google credential stuffing. While we're talking about this, if you're not using MFA everywhere, you should. And there are props, but I forgot to bring them out. If you don't know what these are, you should. These are YubiKeys. They're way more secure than any kind of other MFA you can have. They're complicated to set up, and not everything supports them, so they're not perfect. But where you can use them, they're awesome. You can use them in Azure, just not Azure SQL Database. Anybody here from Azure SQL Database Security? If you're watching, make passwordless security an option. It works in all the other Azure services. YubiKeys are cool. So service accounts as domain admin. Do I really have to explain this? If you're not familiar, a service account can act as just like a user in an environment. In a Windows environment, if you make that service account domain admin, that means it can do anything. And do you really want your SQL server, XP command shell? And you might be like, wait, Joey, we disable XP command shell. Guess what an admin can do? The big risk about why you want to minimize domain admin access within your domain, though, is attackers can grab password hashes out of memory, and then you're really screwed. This is how we get the lateral movement. Admin password hashes are a big risk, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The other thing I'll say, to make this a little more cloud-focused, is managed identities and service principals in your cloud environments. Same concept applies, least privileges. Don't overgrant those things. Because once again, if your Azure SQL Database or Azure MI can have a service principal, and if you grant that service principal global admin, it's functionally the same thing as doing this, except a little bit better, but not much. So I'd like to compliment and yell at Microsoft at the same time here. Port 1433 open to the internet. When you built a SQL server in the Azure portal, at least in 2019, using the SQL Server Marketplace image, they used to give you the option on the front page to open 1433 to the internet. My boss, Denny Cherry, and I were working at a client in Redmond, and we did this one day on a Friday afternoon because we were bored, and we were like, let's open 1433 to the internet, set the SA password to password, and see what happens. And then we opened up Profiler, because Profiler for life, and after about 7 attempts, by the way, these were Azure machines with no data and that weren't connected to anything else. After about 7 attempts, the machine got pwned. The people who hacked the machine inserted new DLLs that were from SQL 6.5 and not secure, and then we deleted our VMs because we didn't want anything really bad to happen. Azure gives you inherently, when you build a VM, click next in the portal, it creates a public IP address. Really cool if you're building a demo. Really not cool if you're building VMs for your job. Just be aware of public IPs. This setting is now buried on the SQL connectivity page when you're building a SQL Server VM, and I think there's a warning, and there should be. But you want to be very careful about what you publicly expose on the internet. This is one of the things that you can kind of do wrong big time in the cloud. Spear phishing. Don't click on anything, ever. Nobody's sending you a FedEx shipment that you weren't expecting. Nothing stuck in customs. PayPal with weird caps is not a real company, and your account isn't suspended. You weren't watching something on Amazon Prime. No bank that's not yours is sending you anything. A lot of email systems are better. Does anyone know of host their own Exchange environment? No hands. Oh, one. Don't. Stop. Email's a tragedy. I'm good on time, so I want to share one thing that happened to me in the last year that was security related. There's this company that's a hosting provider. They like to call themselves a cloud provider. You may have heard of them. They rhyme with SPAC space. And they had a data breach where their hosted Exchange environment got ransomware last December. And because I'm kind of a journalist, I got to talk to their chief product officer. In that talk, which he described how they were running 2 versions, old version of Exchange that he wouldn't say wasn't patched, but he wouldn't say was patched. When I asked about, do you have backups? He legitimately said, we have our Exchange servers in a database availability group, so we didn't really need backups. Yes, he said, we had a cluster, so we didn't need backups. Don't use SPAC space. Public S3 buckets. This also is going to apply to Azure, and I'll talk about it why in a second. But in the early days of Amazon, S3 was one of their first or second services. It stands for Simple Storage Service, I think. It's the equivalent of Azure Blob Storage if you speak Azure. In the early days, this just went onto the internet. When you created an S3 bucket, it was publicly on the internet. It's a lot better now. When you build one, it yells at you a lot if you try to put it on the internet. But the security UI in AWS really sucks. So when you go to create, a storage account, I ran into this. I was testing something for a client, not on the client system, just on a test account, and it was involving like SQL Server data movement, and it was only AdventureWorks data, and I just couldn't get it to work until I made the storage account public, and I didn't care, so I did. But there are all these bots all over the internet that go looking for S3 buckets, and they will steal your data. In my case, they probably stole, DIM products from AdventureWorks, and I don't really care. But this is also a thing in Azure. In Azure, it's a little bit harder to do. You can make a container or objects public. And just recently, like 2 months ago, Microsoft linked a bunch of partner sales data because somebody made an Azure Blob Storage bucket public. Don't put anything, as someone once eloquently said, you never want to put your privates on the internet. So you want to be careful about what you put in public buckets. It's very useful. There are use cases for this. So for example, if you had a static website that was just an HTML page, you would stick it in a public S3 bucket or Azure container. Public MongoDB with no password. For those of you who aren't over 40 in the room, I'll tell you the history here. Also, we have a bunch of friends at MongoDB. SQL Server, way back when, 7, used to give you the option to run with a blank SA password, which I never really understood the reason why. Let's take our highest privilege account and let you assign no password to it. I'm sure somebody had a good idea, but anyway, that was kind of before the internet really existed, or at least before everybody terrible was on the internet. And then somebody really terrible was on the internet, and they wrote a virus called the SQL Slammer, and it was able to prolifically spread across environments because email is terrible, and then it attacked SQL servers with no SA passwords. MongoDB, Elastic DB, there are all sorts of Elastic databases and Mongo databases that are older versions that are on the internet that don't have passwords, and they get breached. So this is bad, don't do it. Even better, use a real database, or put your database behind a firewall. And for those of you who are really in the know, maybe Slava and Joe can fix it. Does anybody still run Windows 2003 or 2000 and is willing to admit it? Okay, good, none of you. That means it's like 5%. Your operating system shouldn't be old enough to drink, in America even. SMB 1.0 is terribly, terribly insecure, and you should just stop. You can use SMB 1.0 in newer OSs, but you have to do all sorts of terrible things and disable all the things Microsoft wants you to leave enabled. But they do that because they don't hate you. SMB 1.0 is a really vulnerable protocol. And speaking not just of SMB, but like any kind of place where you have encryption protocols, you really want to revisit that from time to time, especially in systems that persist. Because encryption protocols change, and by the time I retire, we're going to be at like, 2048-bit encryption if we're not there already, because quantum computers are going to be able to decrypt everything. So private keys in your public repo. I want to give GitHub a lot of credit. There's a whole, and if you're not like well-versed in Microsoft security stuff, it's an ongoing joke that we have Defender for product name, and there are like 35 Defender for product names, and I think there's Defender for GitHub. But one of the things Defender for GitHub does now is we'll alert you if there are credentials or secrets in your code because it's doing code analysis. However, one of the things I want to talk about is that not just don't store passwords in your code, do things securely. So if you're in Azure and you're working on things, if you can use a managed identity anywhere, it's far better than having to pass passwords around. Managed identities mostly just work like service accounts. They're a little bit slightly different. But you also have other options in the cloud for storing things. Azure Key Vault is a native Azure solution that's effectively free. If you're retrieving keys like 10,000 times a day, it's going to have some cost with it. But you can store secrets in Key Vault and access them programmatically without having to worry about doing anything dirty in your code. Or just use a text file. Anything's better than storing your passwords on the internet in an unencrypted fashion. But use a text file before you use LastPass. Has anyone not seen this cartoon? Because I'm in a room full of database professionals. This is the classic SQL injection attack. Did you really name your son Robert Drop Table Students? Oh yes, little Bobby tables we call them. There are still a lot of SQL injection attacks that happen, which kind of doesn't surprise me. Web application firewalls are much better at stopping those attacks, as are modern versions of .NET. So if you're on modern infrastructure, you're kind of in a good spot. However, lots of applications don't update their libraries. They run older versions of code. They run on-prem. So that means SQL injection attacks are still a big risk. But use a web application firewall and sanitize your code. Don't have good inputs. Bad inputs, I should say. Just stop. Security breaches happen, and we do stupid things. The perfect example that I talked about in the session was that Amazon thing I did. I made an S3 bucket public because I just wanted to make some product, their change data capture product thing work for my test, and I didn't really care about the security. But in doing so, I didn't learn the security, so I can't tell myself what the right way to do that is. But I got to my end goal faster. And that's the way a lot of software development happens. Let's face it, our developers aren't our security people. And the developers hate the security people because they slow them down. But it's important because you need to plan how to do things securely. And when you run into those hurdles, you need to think about ways to do things in a more secure manner. We have more tools than ever to do things securely. I would have killed for Azure Key Vault when I was writing a ton of shell scripts years ago. And now, there's no reason to store passwords in a text file on a server in a hidden directory or anything. We don't have to do that. We have tools. So take your time. Don't hard code that password. Yes, MFA is a pain in the ass. However, it's a pain in the ass to unlock my door, and I still do it. MFA is a way of life. You should MFA any account you can MFA on, and also you probably shouldn't use SMS MFA on anything you actually care about. There was an attacker group that was kind of based loosely in London last year that I don't have the name of from the top of my head, but one of the things they had done was hijack Deutsche Telekom, and they were able to therefore get SIM numbers. And so what they were doing in their attacks was taking buying credentials of high-level help desk employees at various technology firms, hijacking their SIMs, and if they couldn't hijack their SIMs, they would just spam them with thousands of MFA requests in the hopes that they would just hit one. And once they hit one, they have a session token. And once they have a session token, you're screwed. So that's the reason for YubiKeys. Azure Active Directory is moving in their MFA. They're having something called number matching. And that's what we call phishing-resistant MFA, and that'll probably be a big thing you'll hear about the rest of the year. And then finally, security is hard. Good security is harder. Whenever you secure something, it makes it more difficult to do the thing. But it's worth it because we don't want to buy Maxim another Lamborghini or Vladimir another missile. On that note, I have 5 seconds left, and I'm done.